What do we want to talk about?
I am him! I am him!
Hey, this is the Red Carpet Ring featuring the Turnbuckle King TBK. Got another good one for you guys. We are here again talking about the Chris Jericho audiobook. Chris Jericho, no, it's a 4-letter word. Audio, this is part 2. We had the part 2 of this whole thing. I will say that Chris Jericho said some interesting things thus far. And also, if you missed out on part 1, the link is in the description of this live here. So you can check out part 1. We are here for part 2. This is part 2. So Chris Jericho is going to talk more about it's an audiobook, but it's a more self-help audiobook. These strategies of what to do to be successful in life. So without further ado, we are on chapter 10. We'll run for about 2 hours. Then there'll be maybe one final part. And then that'll be it for this audiobook. And then on the final part, part 3, then more likely the link for this book will be for this part 2 will be in that description as well. So without further ado, I will go ahead and put part 2 out right now.
Chapter 9, The Viv Savage Principle. Have a good time all the time. We're here for a good time, not a long time. So have a good time. The sun can't shine every day. Trooper, we're here for a good time. Spinal Tap's portly keyboard player Viv Savage gave one of the best pieces of advice in cinematic history when documentarian Marty DeBurgi asked him what his creed for life was. Have a good time all the time. That's my philosophy, Marty. Pretty self-explanatory, right? You have to love what you do and do what you love, and if you don't, then make a change. Doesn't get much easier than that, does it? Whatever your passion may be, no matter how big or how small, no matter how far-fetched or obvious, you owe it to yourself to pursue it with everything you've got. I remember in the mid-90s when I was living in Calgary but working in Mexico, I made the cardinal mistake of falling in love while still making my way up the ladder. I was feeling sad about leaving my girl to go back to wrestle in Mexico for another couple of months and asked my best friend and roommate at the time, Dr. Luther Lenny Olson, for his advice. His response was quick and Viv Savage-esque. Be where you want to be. I took those words to heart and decided I wanted to be in Mexico. So I broke up with the girl and stuck with my plans to further my career. Lenny and Viv were absolutely right. Life is too short to be unhappy with your surroundings and what you're doing. So no matter what your circumstances are, there's always a way to make things better. Never be afraid to go out on a limb and make each day a special one that you'll never forget. In the summer of 2015, I was on a short WWE tour of Japan made up of 2 sold-out shows in the Sumo Hall in Tokyo. I had a pair of matches, one with Finn Balor, one with Neville, and both tore down the house. It's always an honor for me to return to Japan after basically growing up there in the 90s, and I've done a total of 48 tours and counting in the country over the years. I put great importance on those matches and feel a huge responsibility to put on the best show I can, both for myself and the fans who have been following me since my first Japanese tour back in 1991. So after 2 great shows, I was feeling pretty celebratory and wanted to have a couple drinks on the Tokyo town. Thankfully, a few of the lads wanted to join me, so I put together the motley crew of Xavier Woods, Eddie and Orlando Colon, and WWE Dr. Chris Amon. We ended up hooking up with a dude who had a connection at the hottest club in Tokyo, which boasted a private, luxurious karaoke room. Add in some fruit fans we met at the bar, and multiple bottles of Grey Goose, and suddenly you had the perfect recipe for an awesome night. After a great karaoke session featuring classic renditions of songs by Journey, Player, Whitesnake, the Backstreet Boys, Dawkins for the Doc, Taylor Swift, and an amazing version of Ebony and Ivory with Woods and me singing in perfect harmony, I was Ebony, the club provided a stretch limo for us to get back to the hotel. When we pulled up at the front doors of the hotel, I was in full Keith Richards mode, complete with aviator shades, a cigarette, a scarf, and a bottle of anything in hand. I swaggered out of the limo with a cocky smile and was captured perfectly on film by Orlando. I am sure it would have been a much easier flight home if I'd gone to bed early rather than partying until dawn, but that wouldn't have made as good of a story now, would it? However, I wasn't always so Keith Suave and Richards debonair when I was having a good time all the time. Back in 2014, I was taking a red-eye home from Portland, Oregon after a Raw taping with Kevin Nash, Hulk Hogan, and John Laurinaitis, and I happened to be sitting next to Nash. The flight to Atlanta was 5 hours long, and I had planned to sleep the whole way, but one thing led to another, and Big Kev and I started having a few cocktails. I ordered Yeah Boys, Grey Goose and Ice, as described in my renowned cocktail book, Best in the World, for the both of us, and off we went into the great wide open. We ended up hanging in the galley of the plane with Hulk, who had gladly signed autographs and taken pictures with almost every passenger on the plane at that point, having a few laughs and, of course, a few more cocktails. It was a cool experience, as I'd never really hung out with Hulk and Kevin before. We'd been in the trenches together back in WCW, but it was pretty much persona non grata back then, and we didn't run in the same circles. But as S.E. Hinton once wrote, that was then, this is now. And at this point, we were 3 former WWE World Champions flying home from another show. We were also a little loud and a little load ski, which was bothering a few of the other passengers. After a couple complaints, a flight attendant who looked like Mrs. Garrett from The Facts of Life approached us in a huff. "Gentlemen, you have to return to your seats immediately. You are far too loud and people want to sleep. As a matter of fact, the man sitting in 2D has a $25 million meeting in Atlanta first thing in the morning, and he needs his rest." Hulk looked at Mrs. Garrett with a charming smile and said, "Well, if he's got a $25 million meeting in the morning, why didn't he just charter a plane and sleep on that?" His logic made perfect sense to me, and I burst out laughing while Mrs. G scowled like she was Sour Boy from Talkin' Shop. But we didn't want to cause any trouble, so we went back to our seats. I was planning on taking a quick nap until suddenly I belched twice and threw up on myself. I was really surprised because I hadn't barfed from alcohol in years, especially from drinking only Yeah Boys. Upon further evaluation, I realized I hadn't thrown up too much, as there was only a silver dollar-sized dollop of BAP on my right leg. I mentioned to Nash that I had just puked on myself as I cleaned it up with a napkin and some bottled water, and then dozed off. We landed in Atlanta a few hours later, and I bid farewell to Big Kev, then stumbled through the terminal to the gate of my next flight with Johnny and Hulk. As I shuffled down the hallway, dragging ass from lack of sleep and too many Yeah Boys, I noticed the acidic smell of vomit wafting up to my nose. I found that a little strange, as I had already cleaned up the spew on my jeans hours earlier. I was exhausted and collapsed into my seat on the connecting flight, ready to catch some much-needed Z's on the way home. So I closed my eyes and snuggled up against the window, ready to enter Sandman, until once again a pungent pukey aroma assaulted my olfactory. I opened my eyes to check out where the hell the smell was coming from, and then noticed the problem. I hadn't just regurgitated on a small section of my jeans. I had heaved all over my entire left leg. How I'd missed that, I don't know, but I'd been traveling for 3 hours with the smell of acrid smoke and upchuck breath wafting off my body. I had pulled the ultimate rookie faux pas by hurling on myself. I looked across the aisle at the Hulkster and asked, "Hulk, I just realized I have puke all over my leg. Didn't you smell it?" "Of course I smelled it, brother, but I didn't have the heart to tell you. Plus, Mr. $25 million meeting sitting in front of you on the last flight was selling it huge, and I didn't want to spoil the rib." "The rib on who? Mr. $25 million meeting or me?" When Fozzie's Sin and Bones album came out in 2012, it was our biggest success up to that point, chart-wise, sales-wise, and touring-wise. As a result, we went out on tour with a laundry list of great bands, from Metallica to Shinedown to Drowning Pool to Steel Panther, but the band we had the most fun with was British heavy metal legends Saxon. We had a great time touring the States on the Sacrifice and Sin tour, not only because of the chemistry between our two groups, but because of the constant barrage of insults thrown back and forth. Led by the iconic and curmudgeonly Biff Bifford, Saxon were doing their first full U.S. tour in years and had handpicked Fozzy to open the shows. We shared a bus and a road crew, which meant we basically spent 6 weeks in each other's faces and got to know each other quite well. It also meant that Biff and I, the lead singers and respective leaders of our bands, developed a healthy rivalry, which led to busting each other's balls incessantly on a daily basis. I can honestly say that some of the best burns I've ever thought of in my life were directed towards the Biffster, and in turn, some of the best insults I've ever received came from him as well. I would wake up each morning and say to Biff with surprise, "Wow, you're still alive? You know, people of your advanced age," he was 62, "die in their sleep all the time." He could give as good as he got, however, and justified the substantial number of fans who attended Fozzy's VIP meet and greets by saying they were all wrestling fans who could care less about the wank music of Fozzy. I would then point out Fozzy's pretty female fans in the crowd and explain to him that they were called girls, something that Saxon rarely had in their audiences, which were made up primarily of denim and leather-wearing dudes. The rivalry got more serious at the House of Blues in Dallas when Biff informed me that we weren't allowed to use the venue's entire lighting rig during our show because that was reserved for the headliner. "No problem, Biff. As a matter of fact, you can turn off all the lights if you want. We'll play in total darkness and still blow your band away." We argued about everything and anything, and no topic was off limits, but nothing caused as much controversy between us as the chicken. Yes, constant reader, the chicken. A subject so hotly debated that it still elicits laughter from every member of Fozzy whenever somebody brings it up. We've even written a rap song about it that goes something like this. "Where's my chicken? I want chicken. I love chicken. Give me chicken." How did this flavorsome fowl become such a contentious topic, you might ask? Well, it started early in the tour when Biff happened to walk into our dressing room and saw our rider on the table. A band's rider usually includes fresh fruit, a deli tray, potato chips, various chocolates, soft drinks, etc., etc. However, Fozzy's rider stipulates that along with all that stuff, there must also be a roasted chicken in our dressing room at every show. That's a little unusual, I'll grant you, but I made sure to include the chicken on the rider to make sure that we got at least one healthy meal during the day. It must have been a good idea because band after band, from Steel Panther to Slash's Conspirators, have followed my lead and included a chicken on their riders after touring with us. Why Biff, who had been touring since the Dark Ages, had never thought of adding the chicken to his rider, I don't know, but he was not happy that Fozzy had one and Saxon didn't. "Why do you have a chicken, Jericho?" "Because I asked for one, Biff." "Where's my chicken?" "Did you ask for one?" "No." "Well, that's why you don't have one. Now get the hell out of our dressing room, you old fuck." Moments later, I heard him berating his tour manager for not getting him a chicken. Even though he had one the next night, he must have kept forgetting to include it on Saxon's official rider because he would constantly grumble, "There's Fozzy's fucking chicken again," or, "Well, why does Fozzy get a fucking chicken and we don't?" Biff's bitterness over the chicken became a running joke, and it was a constant laugh for us that helped make the tour go by quicker. But after 6 weeks of being together constantly, Biff and I needed a break from each other, and I was happy when we got to the final show at the venue in Vancouver. However, after such a successful run, I wanted to make sure that Biff and his guys had a proper send-off back to the UK. So I asked our tour manager to buy 5 roast chickens and 5 silver platters and bring them into our dressing room during Saxon's set. We grabbed the perky poultry, put them on the silver platters, and waited for the right moment to strike. Saxon tore the house down that night, as they always did. They're one of the best live bands I've ever seen, and the crowd was going nuts as they winded their way towards the end of their set with a rousing rendition of one of their biggest songs, Wheels of Steel. Every night they broke it down and led the crowd in a massive Wheels of Steel chant, and that was going to be our cue. When the sing-along started, we grabbed our silver platters and ambled on stage to serve Biff his much-desired chickens. They had no idea the gag was coming, and when they saw us walk on stage, they burst out laughing, but didn't miss a beat as we fed them various wings, drumsticks, and breasts. Biff stared at me with a "you little shit" look on his face, but I could tell he thought it was pretty funny. After the band had eaten their fill, we threw the rest of the tasty bird into the audience so the fans could enjoy a snack as well. It was an awesome moment, and if you were there that night in Vancouver, feel free to hit me up on the Twitter at @IamJericho and let me know if you were able to grab a piece of the chicken. After the show, Biff said, "That was a good one, you wanker. I was going to buy a couple of electric fans, tear open some pillows, and blow the feathers at you from the side of the stage during your set. But you didn't, Biff." "Yeah, I decided I didn't want to torture myself by sitting through your whole show." "Well played, Biff. Treat yourself to a chicken on me." Thinking about the Saxon rib still makes me smile, and it's a perfect example of going the extra mile to make an experience more memorable whenever you can. You won't regret it, and it always makes for a better story. My wise cousin Chad and I have made it a tradition to attend the annual Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductions. We're obsessed with music, and thanks to meeting the amazing Betsy Hill of Rolling Stone magazine at our first ceremony, we have the ultimate connection to hook us up. In 2015, it was announced that Ringo Starr was finally being honored by the Hall as a solo act and would be inducted by his old bandmate Paul McCartney. Wise cousin Chad and I were stoked because we have been huge Beatles fans since we first got into them at the same time in the early 80s. The show was in Cleveland that year, and Betsy was able to get us arena floor passes, which was awesome because that's where all the inductees and VIPs sat. The only catch was we didn't have an actual seat at any of the tables, so even though security couldn't kick us out, we didn't have anywhere specific to go. So our plan was to roam around the floor and stay out of everybody's way. But if we stood at one spot for too long, security would tell us to move, and we would simply wander to the other side of the venue. Because of Ringo's induction, musical royalty were everywhere. I literally bumped into Stevie Wonder, and Sting, Bruce Springsteen, John Legend, and my buds Alice Cooper and Dave Grohl walked by us at various times as well. Joan Jett was the first to get inducted, followed by Lou Reed and then the Five Royales. As each act was honored, I noticed Paul and Ringo with their wives sitting at a table at the front of the venue, along with Olivia Harrison and Yoko Ono. As is custom, whenever an act was inducted, they would play a short set of their biggest hits, or another artist would play a few songs in tribute to them. At that point, the entire crowd would stand up, cheer along, and watch the artist rock, so nobody really knew who was sitting where. I decided that's when I would make my move. I'd been waiting my whole life to meet Paul and had tried several times at his gigs over the years, but had been shut down by security every time. However, tonight I had my chance. When Green Day was inducted, everyone gave them a standing ovation as they began to play. I'd never seen them before, and they were incredible, full of energy, and had great crowd participation. It was the perfect time for wise cousin Chad and me to make our way up to the front of the arena unnoticed, so we pushed our way through the crowd and situated ourselves at a table directly behind the Fab 2. We gave a friendly greeting to the other people at the table like we had been sitting there all night, and they grinned back, having no idea that we didn't belong there. I didn't care if they did anyway, because we were Beetle hunting, and that was serious business. As I watched the bobbing mop heads in front of me, I couldn't believe I was standing only a few feet away from the two biggest rock stars on the planet. Legends whose band had influenced me and the world more than any other. Their silhouettes walking across Abbey Road were even tattooed on my left arm. It was a surreal experience, especially seeing Paul rocking out to Green Day when they performed American Idiot. During the song, Billy Joe Armstrong led the crowd in a rousing "hey" between the main riff, and Paul seemed to be screaming the loudest, throwing his fist up in the air with every shout. Finally, Green Day finished their short, albeit powerful set, and Macca got up to leave the table with his security guard following closely behind. I assumed he was going to the loo, so I decided to follow. To not be so obvious, I walked down a different row of tables than they did, leading to a fork in the furniture road where Paul and I ended up face to face. I'd been waiting for this moment my whole life and knew I only had a few seconds to make a good impression before the bathroom window closed, so I opened with my best line. "Hey, Paul, I saw you rocking a Green Day. They were pretty damn good, huh?" "Not a bad start." I didn't want to pull the old thank you so much for the music fanboy speech like I did when I first met James Hetfield. I knew nothing would get me on the creepy fanatic radar quicker than that line of conversation. Paul looked at me and replied good-naturedly in his Liverpool lilt, "Yeah, they're pretty fucking good, man." Okay, that was encouraging. I'd gotten a response from him on a dude level, not a go-away stalker level. Now it was time to unleash some witty repartee and show him I was a hilarious cat worthy of hanging out with. "Hey man, I see you got your security in front of you. Just want to let you know that I'll be your backline security if you want, in case any ninjas try to attack you." Paul looked at me quizzically. "Ninjas? Okay, I'll keep that in mind." Then he walked away. Even though I hadn't received an offer to spend the night at his house or gotten his email address, I'd still had a conversation with Paul McCartney, and I thought that was pretty gear. Mission accomplished. But I wanted more and couldn't contain myself. So I finally unfurled my fanboy freak flag, threw my arm in the air and blurted out, "Hey, Paul, high five." Paul glanced up at my raised palm and, to his credit, decided not to leave me hanging. He gamely shaked my hand and walked off to piss. I couldn't believe what had happened. I'd taken a chance to meet Paul and it had worked. Wise cousin Chad and I shared a high five of our own and squealed like a couple of apple scruffs in 1968. We decided to hit the bathroom before grabbing another cocktail from the friendly waitress who had taken pity on us for having no particular place to go. She'd been gracious with the "yeah boys," and we were pretty buzzed by the time we got to the Kansky. It was a big lavatory with two sections, the first equipped with sinks and urinals, and the second boasting a row of stalls and more basins. The pissers were all occupied, so I went around the corner and was waiting in line when an official-looking guy wearing a suit with an official-looking laminate hanging around his neck stomped over. "Everybody needs to clear the bathroom. I've got Yoko coming in." The other guys in the biffy chuckled, but suit and tie guy wasn't laughing. "I'm serious. Yoko is coming in, so everybody has to leave." There was no doubt that this guy was serious, so everybody followed his directions and got out of the bathroom. Everybody, that is, except for me. The washroom cleared out fast, leaving me completely alone in the room. So in the fine tradition of having a good time all the time, I decided to stick around, inside one of the stalls. There were 3 of them lined up in the bathroom, so I chose the middle one. I went inside, locked the door, and then crouched down on the top of the commode like a teenage camper hiding from Jason Voorhees in a Friday the 13th movie. I'm not sure what my plan was, but it seemed like a good idea at the time until I started thinking about what I would do if she decided she wanted to use the middle biffy. I waited a few minutes until I heard the distinct Japanese accent of Yoko Ono. She was with another lady, and why wouldn't she be? I mean, even Yoko goes to the bathroom with a friend, right? The bad news was my chances of being busted in the middle cubicle had just doubled. I crouched on the stall helplessly, waiting to be exposed, but then the hand of outhouse fate stepped in. "I'll go in this one," Yoko said, and went into the toilet on my left. Her friend must have wanted a little buffer, so she thankfully went into the one on my right, and I thanked Lucy in the sky with diamonds that I'd been left undetected. I waited in silence, wondering what was going to happen next, when I heard the distinct sound of cloth being pulled across skin. Then I saw a corner of the black dress she was wearing slide under the wall of the cubicle and heard the faint tinkling sound of liquid hitting the toilet water. I got out my phone and texted Wise Cousin Chad discreetly, "Dude, I'm hiding in the bathroom as Yoko pisses beside me," as the sound of Yoko's flow permeated my ears. Now, let me take a moment to say there's no question that my actions were incredibly creepy and totally invasive to Miss Ono's privacy. But the whole thing is also pretty fucking funny and makes for an amazing story, so I accept and own said criticism. Now, back to our story. After a few seconds, the piece of black dress disappeared back under the stall, and I heard Yoko stand up and flush. She unlocked the door and walked out of the potty. This was my cue. I stepped off the throne, unlocked the door, and came face to face with Yoko Ono. I couldn't believe how tiny she was, but her presence was huge as she gazed at me stoically. I raised my hands and looked around confusedly. "Oh my goodness, I am so sorry. I thought this was the boys' bathroom." "It is the boys' bathroom. I was just using it," she said, looking over the rims of her prominently placed sunglasses. "Well, I'm sorry for interrupting you, Yoko." "It's okay," she said softly, and walked over to the sink. I felt weird and I wasn't sure if she believed me or not, but I don't blame her if she didn't. I'm sure stupid idiots like me pull this type of shit on her all the time, and she deals with crazy fans on a daily basis. But even though I might have been crazy, I wasn't a filthy animal and still wanted to wash my hands. So I sidled up to the sink next to hers. She glanced over and smiled as I turned on the faucet, and I couldn't believe how surprisingly pleasant she was under the circumstances. Are you having a fun night, Yoko? Oh yes, so nice to see everybody. I soaped up and washed the lather off my hands under the lukewarm water from the tap. When I was done, I turned the faucet off and shook my hands to get rid of the residual drops. Then I looked around and noticed that all of the paper towel receptacles were empty. At this point, one of the security guards came with a stack of napkins and gave them to Yoko. As she dried off her hands, she noticed I was towelless and offered her stack of serviettes to me. Here, take one of these. You can't leave with wet hands. I was touched by her offer to spare a square. Thank you so much, Yoko, I said as I grabbed a napkin and dried my hands off. I hope you have a great night. Thank you, she replied, and was shuffled off by her handlers, the biggest of which stared at me like he wanted to rip my clean hands clean off. Wow, I have no idea what just happened, I declared to the guy in amazement and brushed past him out the door. Wise cousin Chad was waiting outside and burst out in laughter when I told him what had happened. Once again, I know it was a creepy thing to do, but it made for the tale of a lifetime and a great chapter for this book, and therefore it was worth it. However, I would officially like to apologize to Yoko for invading her privacy, and I thank her for being so gracious to me, even though I'm quite sure she knew I was full of shit. Or pee in this case. The night progressed, and we decided to go straight to the front row for Ringo's speech and the subsequent mini-concert, where he played his biggest hits with Paul, Joe Walsh, Paul Schaefer, Joan Jett, and the Green Day guys. If you ever see the telecast on HBO, you might notice a guy who keeps blocking McCartney's face on the hard camera shot by waving his tattooed arms in the air like he just don't care. Constant reader, of course, that was me. When the ceremony was over, Betsy got Wise cousin Chad and me passes to the exclusive Rolling Stone after party, which once again was packed with dignitaries. I had great conversations with Billy Joe from Green Day, a Fozzy fan who'd enjoyed watching Rich and me on a recent episode of VH1's That Metal Show, and Paul Schaefer, with whom I'd been on the Jimmy Fallon show a few years prior. We also witnessed poor Robbie Robertson sitting in a booth talking to himself, saw drummer Anton Fig literally eating a fig, and gave our favorite fashion designer John Varvatos some sage advice. Please, don't ever go out of business, Wise cousin Chad stammered as John nodded and took notes. But the biggest star of them all was once again only a few feet away. I noticed Paul having a drink with his wife and Joe Walsh in the booth next to us. People were approaching him and asking for autographs and pictures, but after already having my McCartney moment earlier in the night, I didn't want to bother him any further. Plus, after hearing him mention on Chris Hardwick's podcast, curse you for getting him, Hardwick, that he loved talking to fans but felt very uncomfortable when they asked for a picture because at that point he ceased being Paul and turned into that famous guy, I decided to leave him be. With those words in mind, I was happy just hanging around his general vicinity and drinking in the fruit vibes he was sending out. However, when he got up to get some food, he was surrounded again, so I decided to extend an offer of help. Hey, Paul, I approached and said, if you're getting bothered too much, just let me know and I'll clear everybody out of the way. Confused by my offer, Paul looked up at me and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. I could tell he remembered me from earlier. I was on cloud number 9 because this was the part when he was going to say he watched me on TV and was a big fan of my work. Then he would give me his cell phone number, follow me on Twitter, like me on Facebook, and become my new best friend, sorry, Kevin Owens. Paul opened his mouth, and as I prepared to accept his invitation to go on tour with him, he threw me a curveball. Who are you, man? That wasn't what I was expecting. But maybe I hadn't heard him correctly. Who are you, man? Nope, I'd heard him correctly. He repeated with his whimsical accent. I saw you before. Are you a security guard or a cameraman? A cameraman? Did he think I worked for TMZ or some shit? I stood there trying to think of another witty response, but before I could stammer anything out, Paul cut me off. Listen, man, if I need any help with the ninjas or anybody else, I'll let you know, okay, mate? He gave me a thumbs up and turned away. I was happy he remembered my ninja comment, but I smelled what he was cooking. He was friendly with his tone, but his overall message was, you're starting to creep me out, dude, so please leave me alone. I don't blame him for feeling a weird vibe about me. After all, I had just hid in a toilet stall and listened to his late best friend's wife take a leak. Chapter 10, The 12th Ninja Principle. Enjoy the moment. I know for sure that life is beautiful around the world. Red Hot Chili Peppers around the world. When Vanilla Ice guested on Talk is Jericho, I found him to be a friendly, humble, and inspiring guy who realized it was an honor to be able to survive and prosper in show business for over 25 years. After years of being embarrassed by the monster success of Ice Ice Baby, he had recently embraced it and as a result was enjoying a massive resurgence both as a musician and as a TV star after he reinvented himself as a home renovation expert. We had a great chat in one of the homes he had fixed up for the Vanilla Ice project, his home improvement show on the DIY network, and during our interview he passed on a great piece of advice from an 85-year-old friend of his whom he nicknamed the 12th Ninja. Slow down, don't stress, and enjoy what you have, because in the end you're going to end up old just like me anyways. That wise ninja was right. I find that life moves fast, with so much going on at all times that it's easy to forget to enjoy the fruits of your labors and savor the successes along the way. The problem with being on a Fozzy tour or working a full WWE schedule is that there's always another match or another concert just a few hundred miles down the road, so one tends to bleed into the other. But that's no excuse not to take a moment for yourself to enjoy the experience, to drink it in, man. Around 2002, right as The Rock left the WWE to become a worldwide movie star, he told me, appreciate every match you have. At some point, it's going to be your last one, and you won't believe how fast it's all gone. Take a moment for yourself and look at the crowd. Enjoy their reactions, because when it's time for it to end, you're going to miss it. I know I already do. I took his advice and always take a few seconds after a match to stand at the top of the stage and experience the moment, because I don't know when I'll be back in that city again. It's like Ferris Bueller said, life moves pretty fast. If you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it. Truer words were never spoken. I encourage everyone reading to listen to the Sausage King of Chicago and take a look around sometimes. It sounds a little cliched, but I'm telling you, there is some truth here. Live in the moment, smell the metaphorical roses, and don't just rush onto the next appointment or goal in your life. This is even truer after a victory or a success. Don't forget to acknowledge all the hard work you've put in, or more importantly, the people who've helped you along the way, especially your family. I couldn't have accomplished all the things I have without the support of my incredible and beautiful wife, Jessica. She's my rock and supports me through all the ups and downs of my career and my life. Every success I have is a shared victory, and without her love and advice, I wouldn't be as driven or as bold with my decisions. I also have 3 amazing children who are my raison d'etre and drive me to be the best that I can be in whatever I do. It's a huge sacrifice to be away from Ash, Cheyenne, and Sierra for weeks at a time sometimes, so if I'm going to pay that stiff price, I won't accept anything less than performing at my absolute best when I'm on the road. I owe that to them, and their love pulls me through. But when all of the hard work causes everything to line up and you hit the jackpot, it makes all of the sacrifices worthwhile. That's why you owe it to yourself to count those proverbial tokens coming out of the machine, listen to the jingling sounds they make as they fill up that plastic cup, and savor the thrill of your victories. After every performance, I'm always the last guy in the dressing room, as I like to sit there and reflect upon the night. The late Roddy Piper once told me that being a main eventer was the loneliest position in the company, because by the time you finish your match and get back to the dressing room, everybody else is gone. He was right, but I never had a problem being by myself after the show. I like relaxing and analyzing that night's performance while I listen to tunes, changing out of my sweaty clothes, and having a drink. One of my favorite things to do after Fozzy gigs is hang out with our drummer Frank Fonseray and talk about music and life. Make sure to take that time to celebrate your success. You work too hard not to. In 2016, we had the biggest WrestleMania of all time in front of over 100,000 people at AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Texas. Now, I've worked over a dozen stadium shows in my career, but I never take it for granted when I have the honor of performing in such a giant venue in front of a massive, enthused crowd. So, a few hours before the show began, I made my customary pilgrimage to the top of the massive WrestleMania stage and wandered back and forth from one side of the gargantuan structure to the other, surveying the thousands of empty seats in front of me. It was a kind of a WrestleMania tradition for me, as it helped clear my head and gave me the chance to reflect on how much I'd been through on my way back to that grand stage. As I was drinking it in before WrestleMania 32, I saw Vince walk on stage to survey the Brobignian box of Bootios that was to be the centerpiece of the New Day's entrance. They were rehearsing the tipping of the box where random Bootios would scatter across the stage, revealing the hugely popular trio. I walked over to Vince and said, "Wow, the biggest WrestleMania of all time, huh?" "It's incredible, right?" he answered. "Over 100,000 people will be here in just a few hours." I smiled and said, "You've come a long way since New Haven, kid." Vince grinned and swatted me away with his rundown sheet, laughing at the fact that I knew New Haven was the first arena his father had allowed him to promote in the mid-70s. As I walked back down the ramp, I glanced over my shoulder and saw Vince looking out at the empty stadium with a satisfied look on his face. There was no doubt in my mind that he was enjoying the moment, and that made me happy. WrestleMania is a once-a-year milestone that's revered by everyone in the WWE and the biggest show of the year for the company. It's very special to me as well, but there's another annual occasion that personally is more important, and that's October 2nd, the date of my very first match in 1990. You need to appreciate those personal milestones in your life, and I have honored this one since October 2nd, 1995, my 5th anniversary in the wrestling business. I was on tour for WAR in Japan with Los Brazos, a trio of luchador brothers I'd met while working in Mexico. And when they found out that my debut match was exactly 5 years earlier, they bought me a cake to celebrate. Don't ever forget those special days, my friend. Every year that you continue to do what you love to do is a blessing, said El Brazo, the middle brother. I've never forgotten what he told me, and every year on October 2nd, I say a prayer thanking the Lord for allowing me to continue to do what I love to do, whether I'm currently wrestling in the WWE or not. In 2015, I was working with the company, and coincidentally, a Madison Square Garden date had been booked on October 3rd, which was exactly the 25th anniversary, plus 1 day, of my first match. I decided I wanted to do something extra special to commemorate my silver anniversary on the job and share the date with the guys who were there with me at the beginning. I called Lance Storm, Dr. Luther, Lenny St. Clair, Don Callis, and Brett Como, inviting all of them to fly to New York City to hang with me for a couple days and go to the show. I wanted to give them a small token of appreciation to let them know how much their friendship meant to me both in the early days and now. With the exception of Como, everyone was able to make it, and from the moment we saw each other again, even though we hadn't been in the same room together for over 20 years, it was like not a minute had passed. The true brothers you meet in the business and spend so much time with on the road are like war buddies. Guys you fought with in the trenches that you have a special bond with that lasts forever. Whenever you see them, even if it's been a long period of time, you pick up right where you left off, which usually means busting each other's balls incessantly. Callis immediately complained that I hadn't flown him first class. Lenny and I slipped right into our old made-up road characters we had invented in the mid-90s, and Lance cracked a smile. Once. We went to a late-night diner to catch up, and as we were sitting around laughing, a street artist drew the absolute worst picture of us that you could imagine. We gave the guy $10 for it anyway, as we had to have the picture and couldn't let such a hideous effort go unrewarded. The guys then presented me with a mock old-school wrestling poster featuring old promo pictures of the four of us from the early 90s. It was the most amazing gift they could have given me, and I loved it, although I'm not exactly sure where I put it. It's in my house somewhere. In return, I gave them each a special Y25J commemorative 25th anniversary t-shirt that the WWE was selling for one night only at MSG. The next night at the show, WWE.com interviewed all three of them and gave them a nice rub by putting an extensive article up on the website detailing where their various careers had led them over the years. We took pictures backstage together, which was especially cool and personally significant for Lenny, who had never been to MSG before, and Don, who had made his WWE debut there as the Jackal almost 25 years prior. When I had mentioned my 25th anniversary plans to Vince a few months earlier, he loved the idea and insisted that the guys sit at the timekeeper's table, but the night of the show, he decided to have them sit in the front row instead. The decision had been made to make the show a live WWE Network special, which meant time constraints on my match with Kevin Owens. But I still wanted to cut a pre-match promo and figured after 25 years on the job, if I wanted some time to address the crowd, I should get it. I wanted to enjoy the moment of such an important occasion. How many guys stay successful in the wrestling business for over 25 years? And share some of my MSG memories with some of the greatest Jerichoholics in the world. I started the promo by pointing up to the stands where I was sitting as a 4-year-old kid when I got mad at my dad for not waving to me when he was on a breakaway as a New York Ranger. Then I pointed out my 3 friends in the front row and gave them each a shout out, thanking them all for what they had done for me throughout my career. I told a few other anecdotes and threw out a couple classic catchphrases before finishing up so Owens and I could start our match. The promo went long, which cut our match down to about 12 minutes, but we made the most of it and had a pretty damn good little contest, which of course I lost. It was the right finish, as 25th anniversary or not, I still had a responsibility to do what was best for business. But it was an amazing way to celebrate my quarter-century jubilee, and the night was just beginning. I had received an invite from Benjamin's Steakhouse, one of the best in New York City, to celebrate the occasion with my pals gratis. We had an outstanding meal, and I looked like a real big shot when the check came and everything was on the house. Callis finally stopped bitching about not flying first class. Then we went back to the 5-star hotel I had booked us in and recorded the Jericho 25th anniversary episode of Talk is Jericho, which ended up being one of the funniest in the show's history. The laughs began right off the bat when I pulled a desk back from the wall to access the electrical outlet and found a condom wrapper and a Yankees ticket stub from 3 years prior. 5-star hotel my ass. It was the perfect starting point for 90 minutes of pure ridiculousness that ended up with Lance collapsing on the floor from a laughing fit. Storm isn't exactly known for his chuckling skills, but he sure as hell let loose that night. He was literally rolling around on the ground, unable to stop as the tears poured from his eyes. For such a long time, I was able to take a dozen pictures for proof. If you haven't heard that podcast, you need to go online and check it out now. If you don't find it funny, I'll personally give you your money back, even though it's free. As much fun as we had, my favorite part of the whole weekend was reconnecting with my old friends, who admittedly I should have kept in better contact with over the years. But spending those few days with my bros helped me remember how close we were and how deep our connection would always be. Now I text with all 3 guys almost daily, and we are closer than ever. The whole 25th anniversary experience was the perfect example of taking extra measures to relish the moment, to appreciate life, and to thank lifelong friends for all they'd done along the way. In closing, I'll see you all at Madison Square Garden on October 3rd, 2040 for the Jericho 50th anniversary celebration. Maybe I'll even hold a contest to see which one of you lucky friends of Jericho gets to wheel me to the ring. Chapter 11, The Groundlings Principle. Always commit. Who can go the distance? We'll find out in the long run. Eagles, the long run. I walked away from the WWE for the first time in August of 2005 because I was burned out and had no interest in working in the wrestling business anymore. It was a scary time for me, a kind of midlife career crisis, if you will, as I was uncertain of where the future was going to take me. In retrospect, taking a break from the company was the best decision I could have ever made because those 27 months away from wrestling not only gave me the chance to realize how much I wanted to be in the WWE, but they also gave me the opportunity to expand my horizons. I learned some very important additional skills during that time, which I used to become a better performer in the long run, and I ain't talking about Joe Walsh. One of the main lessons I learned from working with the famed Los Angeles improv comedy troupe, The Groundlings, was to always commit. In improv, always committing means that no matter how ridiculous the situation is on stage, you give it 100% to make it as real and as funny to the audience as possible. If you are supposed to be a giant duck delivering pizzas to Lady Gaga, and you show any hesitation with your performance, the audience can smell that from a mile away and you'll bomb. In other words, if you don't buy what you're selling, why would anybody else? That mindset doesn't just apply to improv, constant reader. It can and should be used in all aspects of your life. In the classic words of my boy Hurricane Helms, If you ain't in, then you must be out. The idea of always committing is an offshoot of the believe in yourself mantra that we've been talking about throughout this entire tome, but this goes a step further. Always committing also means making a promise to yourself, an oath that you'll follow through with no matter how hard things get without compromise. It's not easy to do, but I promise that if you always commit, you'll eventually get what you want. The biggest and most prestigious annual heavy metal festival in the world is German's Wacken Festival, and Fozzy had been trying without success to get booked there since we started in 2000. At first, I think it was because the organizers thought we were just a novelty band, but when we released our first all-original album, All That Remains, in 2005, they finally showed a little interest in booking us, but with a catch. They wanted me to wrestle as well. Every year, besides having over 100 bands play, the Wacken Festival includes carnival rides, tattooing, face painting, and a live wrestling show for which the promoters wanted to book me on in exchange for using Fozzy. I realized early on in Foztory that it was best for the band and myself to keep the church and state of rock and roll and wrestling separate. It was hard enough for us to gain respect as a legitimate kick-ass rock band in the early years solely because I was the singer. A lot of people assumed that because I was a celebrity from another field, that Fozzy was just a vanity project and couldn't possibly be any good. In some ways, I don't blame them, as there had been enough Dog Stars, Wicked Worlds, and the return of Brunos for haters to compare us to. But as we matured over the years, and it became apparent that we could blow a lot of other bands off the stage, I knew we had a real chance to get to the next level. I believe the best way to do that would be to keep a division between my two careers, to show people we were in this to rock the world, not to rock my ego. Therefore, I felt that if I acquiesced to Wacken's request to work double duty, it would be the equivalent of Taylor Momsen delivering a Cindy Lou Who monologue before a Pretty Reckless set just because she was in How the Grinch Stole Christmas when she was 7. I told our manager, Mark Willis, to turn them down unless it was for Fozzy only. He was more than happy to do so, and we were excluded from the Wacken bill for yet another year. When Chasing the Grail came out in 2010, we got another offer from Wacken with a better slot on the bill and an additional $5,000 if I would lace up the boots and get in the ring. Now, don't get me wrong, $5,000 is a nice chunk of change and way more than I would make for a WWE live event in Asheville, North Carolina on a Sunday afternoon, but that wasn't the point. We had told the festival organizers that Fozzy would be happy to come to Germany and kick everybody's asses, but we weren't interested in me wrestling as well. So once again, the answer was no. We were fine with it, though this had gone beyond just playing the festival. It had become a war of attrition between us and the promoters. They knew the terms we had given them to appear on the festival, yet they kept trying to con us into doing it their way regardless. Also, we had already played Download along with most of the other big festivals in the UK multiple times, and they hadn't asked us for anything more than to put on a killer show. So we felt like the precedent had been set. We were a damn good rock and roll band and should be treated as such. It's not like they asked Rob Zombie to hang out in a field and operate the Ferris wheel before his set, so why did I have to wrestle before we played ours? When we released Sin and Bones in 2012, once again Wacken wanted me to wrestle, and once again I said absolutely not. The organizers were baffled, and I felt at this point that we had worn out our Willkommen. It was a drag, but I still believe that if we stuck to our guns, we would get our chance to play Wacken someday on our own terms. Lo and behold, I was right. As fate would have it, we were booked at Download that year for the second time, this time on the bigger second stage, and drew a ridiculous crowd of over 20,000 Fozzy fanatics at the ungodly hour, at least for a rock show, of 12:30 p.m. We played one of the best shows of our career, and plenty of heavy hitters in the industry were there to take notice, including a big wig talent booker who represented, you guessed it, Wacken. He was so impressed with our music and stage presence that it wasn't long afterwards that we got an offer to play the following year's festival with a good guarantee, good stage positioning, and more importantly, no wrestling required. By committing to our vision of who we were as a band and refusing to compromise said vision, we got what we wanted and then some. We had an awesome Wacken debut in front of a great crowd of 8,000 who showed up even though we were clashing with Alice Cooper, who was playing on the main stage right beside us. The crowd went so nuts for us that 3 of our songs were included on the live video compilation of the festival, even though most other bands only had 2. Don't get me wrong, I know it's hard to stay committed to your beliefs at times, especially when there's a nice paycheck being dangled in front of your face, but that's nothing compared to the difficulties of staying dedicated to the cause when your professional reputation is in question. When I came back to the WWE in January 2016 after another 15-month hiatus from television, the plan was for me to eventually turn heel. I'd been a babyface for the last 3-odd years, but with my frequent breaks from the company, it seemed that each return brought me one step closer to overstaying my welcome with the fans. Plus, my Y2J act was getting stale, and there was only so much more I could do in that role, so I knew the time was ripe to turn heel again. I was actually looking forward to it, as there's a certain comfort level I have as a heel that I don't have when I'm a good guy. Case in point, I'm a 6-time WWE World Champion, and every one of those has been as a heel. So with that in mind, I was excited to get back to doing what I do best, pissing people off. The original idea was for me to turn right after the Royal Rumble, but then I started working with AJ Styles, and Vince decided to stretch out our program for a few more months. He wanted me to stay babyface a little longer as a result, but even though my turn wasn't imminent, I started doing subtle things to annoy the fans and plant the seeds for the heel turn that was coming up around the bend. The first step was simple: stop wearing a shirt. I'd walk to the ring wearing a blazer with nothing underneath or a vest with tight jeans and boots. I have no idea why this rubbed people the wrong way, but I started getting dozens of tweets daily with comments like, "Can't Jericho afford any clothes?" or "I'm begging Jericho to put on a shirt." Those kind of responses showed me I was getting under people's skin, which theoretically isn't a good thing when you're supposed to be a babyface, but in the big picture was perfect. Then I added a scarf to the ensemble, and judging by the outraged reaction it received, you would have thought I was wearing a bra and panties made of baby seal skin to the ring. I never would have guessed how much controversy a simple piece of fancy fabric wrapped around my neck could cause, and I received more negative feedback about that thing on a daily basis from the moment I started wearing it. The scarf has even become a staple of my act on live events when I refuse to take it off until my opponent strips it off me, to the delight of the fans. It's quite the crowd pleaser when Finn Balor or Roman Reigns prance around the ring, then take it off and blow their nose with it. Not fair, I say. After the dodgy wardrobe choices, the next step to making sure people continued getting sick of me was shoving the stale elements of babyface Jericho down their throats. For example, overusing the catchphrases I'd been spouting since the George W. Bush administration worked like a charm. Every week I would stand in the middle of the ring on Raw and say, "Welcome to Raw is Jericho," or "Would you please shut the hell up?" And of course, "You will never, ever be the same again." All of those were top 10 hits on the WWE catchphrase charts 15 years ago, but lamely spouting them out ad nauseum in the modern era made me seem flat and out of touch. Once again, I started getting a ton of negative feedback echoing that sentiment, which to me was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was cool to know that my plan was working, but on the other hand, it was hard to not scream from the rooftops that I wasn't actually out of touch, but rather I knew exactly what I was doing. I was working everyone with my true commitment. The night I returned to Raw in San Antonio in January 2016, I was involved in a segment with The New Day, one of the freshest acts to grace the WWE in a long time. I took great pride when they started their rise to popularity, as I had predicted they would be big a year earlier, and even had them on Talk as Jericho when they were still a prelim act. Big E, Xavier Woods, and my old rival Kofi Kingston were hip, contemporary, funny, and had chemistry coming out of their bootios, so I was excited to be working with them. When you're dealing with an act as unique as New Day, who had gotten toy unicorn horns, a trombone, and a box of cereal over, you had to play along with them. I couldn't go out there and no-sell their goofiness or try to be uber serious, because that would ignore what had gotten them over and essentially bury them. I had to play along with their quirkiness, so I came up with the idea of calling them Rudy Tooty Booty, which doesn't make sense, and if we're calling an ace of spades an ace of spades, is really fucking stupid. But the kicker is, I knew it was stupid. It might have gotten over huge in the salad days of the Attitude Era, when fans were chanting whatever I wanted them to. Filthy, dirty, disgusting, brutal, bottom-feeding trash bag hoe comes to mind. But this one wasn't getting much traction. Was it painful to lead a Rudy Tooty Booty chant with only 20% of the audience joining in? Of course it was, but that was the price I had to pay to keep the facade of my out-of-touch, slightly annoying character rolling. Eventually, Rudy Tooty Booty died a much-deserved death, and I ended up turning heel on AJ Styles after a classic tag team title match with the New Day in Chicago. Suddenly, my character was rejuvenated on the strength of great matches and a slew of surprise late career hit catchphrases like "Stupid Idiot," "Drink It In, Man," "The Gift of Jericho," and "Quiet, Quiet, Quiet." Don't even get me started on the list of Jericho. That's for another book. I even gave myself a challenge to get the word "it" over. It took a minute, but after repeating it on Raw at opportune times over the next few months, I got it over too. The fans and critics went from demanding my retirement to proclaiming this run as one of my best ever. But that stupid idiot era of Jericho never would have been so successful had I not committed by planting those seeds early on as the feted Y2J character. Even though it was hard having people question my skills and relevancy, I committed to the long-term story and endured the criticism, knowing what I was working towards. It's like the story Paul McCartney told about rock critics in 1967 proclaiming the Beatles to be old news because they'd stopped touring and had outlived their welcome, while in reality they were secretly in the studio recording Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the greatest album of their career. They ignored the criticism, stayed committed to their art, and had huge success as a result. So, the next time I start a Rudy Tooty Booty chant, just shut up and play along, okay? Chapter 12, The Brian Pillman Principle, Do Something Different. I never played by the rules. I never really cared. Skid Row, Youth Gone Wild. Earlier in this palimpsest, you read about the impact that Paul Stanley had on me as a teenager. But as I was growing up and getting involved in the wrestling business, another performer who was just as big of an influence on me was the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels. I'd go so far as to say that when I started out wrestling, I basically copied him. I grew my hair into a sweet mullet, dyed it canary yellow like Shawn, wore ring gear that was as closely modeled to HBK's as I could afford, and ripped off his trademark high spots move for move. But it didn't take me long to realize that being a direct copy of Shawn, while fine for starters, would put me in a specific box and limit my potential for success. So, by taking a few of Shawn's best qualities, adding some of Paul's magic, and throwing them into a show business blender along with a healthy dollop of me, I now had something. I was never interested in being the next whomever. I just wanted to be the first Chris Jericho because I knew if I wanted to make it, I had to do something different. The late Brian Pillman hammered this principle home to me the one and only time our paths crossed at an ECW house show in 1996. His last weekend with the company happened to be my first. We hit it off right away, and I'm guessing that's partly because he knew I had trained in Calgary like he did, and partly because Chris Benoit was a mutual friend. We sat in the corner of the dressing room / basement of the Lost Battalion Hall in Queens, New York, where Brian filled me in on his upcoming plans to go to WCW and start the New Age Four Horsemen, who would use a two arms crossed and an X gesture instead of the iconic four fingers up sign, with Benoit and Dean Malenko. He asked me if I would consider being the fourth member, and I told him I'd check my busy schedule. Actually, I said abso-fucking-lutely because I would have given up everything and done it in a second if given the opportunity. Unfortunately, I never saw Brian again nor heard another word about the New Age Horsemen, so I assumed the angle was dropped. But what I remember most about our conversation was Brian telling me about his decision to reinvent himself as the loose cannon, a subtly crazy hothead who would lash out in uncontrollable outbursts at random. It was a completely different persona from the squeaky clean babyface he had embodied in the ring for the past decade. I asked him why he felt the need to change things up, considering the amount of success he'd already had. He looked off into the corner of the room and murmured softly, "If you want to really make it in this business, you have to do something nobody has ever done before." Then, as if to illustrate his point, he got up and wandered around the locker room, asking people if they had an extra belt to hold up his jeans because they were the wrong size. Nobody did, so he settled on a piece of rope, like a brown piece of twine that a hobo in a cartoon would wear, that he had found beneath one of the tables in the back room. He ran the rope through his belt loops with bugged-out eyes and a satisfied, crooked grin. Then he walked around the room asking rhetorical questions and making random statements in his raspy voice. "Have you ever seen the rain? I noticed your shoelaces. Do you like mine? Isn't it great to be living in America?" Bryan didn't say anything over the top crazy or offensive, but it was all very weird. And that was the exact image he wanted to portray because he was doing everything he could to work the WWE and WCW brass into a bidding war. He ended up acting so wacky that he legitimately freaked out some of his peers. Bobby Heenan thought he was totally off his rocker, and even conned Eric Bischoff into giving him his WCW release to fool the fans into thinking the company wanted nothing to do with him. Bryan then took that WCW release to Vince McMahon in Stamford, and in one of the biggest double crosses in wrestling history, used it to sign a lucrative WWE multi-year contract. He built himself from a mid-sized, mid-card white meat babyface to a believably dangerous main event heel in the land of the giants. And he did it by doing something that had never been done before. Sadly, Bryan passed away a few years later, so he didn't reach his main event potential, but I never forgot his words. Whether it was a top-knot fountain ponytail, different facial hair every week, wearing suits and speaking $10 words in a slow voice, or sporting a vest with no shirt and a scarf, I always made sure to do something nobody else was doing. But for me, being original just came naturally. And long before I ever met Brian Pillman, I was trying to stand out in any way I could. In the early 90s, I painted my nails black, got both ears pierced multiple times, wore eyeshadow with a rhinestone choker, put pink streaks in my hair, was one of the first wrestlers to wear kick pads in North America, and even rocked a color-coordinated black and white checkerboard suit that made me look like Rick Nielsen on the gas. Nothing was too outlandish for me. I never really cared what anybody else thought of me because I knew that no matter their opinion, they would at the very least remember me. I mean, look how much traction I've gotten from wearing that stupid scarf. I kept the same mindset when I was putting together ideas for my wrestling storylines. With every return to the WWE, I wanted to do something different, which caused my stature within the company to grow with both the fans and the office. As a result, I was allowed more input into my angles. When AJ Styles debuted at the 2016 Royal Rumble, there was a huge buzz about him throughout the entire WWE universe. Everybody was excited to see what he could do within the company, except the boss himself. Vince never gets too excited at first by new hires who have made their names elsewhere. Just like when I initially arrived in the WWE, all of the fanfare generated from AJ's debut didn't mean that much to Mr. McMahon. As with every performer who has ever drawn a WWE paycheck, until you step into one of Vince's rings, nothing else you had accomplished during your career really mattered. The fans might have been thrilled to see what AJ could bring to the table, but Vince would believe it when he saw it with his own two eyes. That's why I was excited to work with the phenomenal one and help make his entrance into my company as smooth as possible. I had the perfect opportunity the night after the Rumble when I showed up in Miami for Raw and found out that AJ and I were working together for the first time ever. But when I heard that the match was only meant to be a one-night thing, I went to Vince and suggested that AJ and I start an angle that would culminate at the next pay-per-view a few weeks later. He agreed, and after that pay-per-view, Vince was so impressed with our chemistry that he decided to stretch the storyline out all the way to WrestleMania. Over the next few months, we constructed an exciting narrative filled with countless twists and turns along the way. AJ and I started as rivals, then eventually shook hands and decided to work together as a unit. But since this was the WWE, I knew that it would be hard to convince the fans that one of us wasn't going to turn on the other, which was, of course, the exact plan. So when we beat the New Day in a non-title match on Raw, leading to a rematch for the WWE tag titles the following week in Chicago, I knew we needed to come up with something that would convince fans that AJ and I were going to be around for the long haul. So I had the idea of producing an AJ Jericho team t-shirt that would go on sale exclusively at the arena in Chicago, leading the fans in attendance to think, well, they have their own merch, so they must be sticking around for a while. I called the WWE merchandise team to find out the chances of producing Y2AJ t-shirts on a short notice. Cool authors aside, I know Y2AJ is a pretty brutal name, and that's why I wanted it used. Considering we were designed to be a short-term team, there was no reason to think of something better. But if we ever team again, I promise we'll think of a catchier moniker. I knew that doing a one-off shirt was possible because we'd made one for the Y2J 25th anniversary show a few months earlier, so I was surprised when the merch guys said they didn't know if there was enough time to produce them. That didn't fly for me, as I knew they could make it happen if they really had to. So in the fine tradition of principle number 5, don't take no for an answer, I politely explained how important it was to have them ready. I hung up the phone and promptly called Vince, who liked the idea so much that he wanted them ready to sell online on WWE.com the next day, as well as in the arena the following week. Armed with that info, I called the merch guys back and asked again if they could have them ready on time. When the dude told me they thought they could do it, I said, great, I'll let Vince know. And by the way, he wants them up on .com tomorrow. Needless to say, the shirts were ready to go the next day, and while they didn't sell all that well, the desired effect was achieved. By merely seeing that the merch was available, the fans assumed that Y2AJ was a real team who was about to have a substantial run, not a couple of guys who were going to break up as quickly as they got together. I ended up turning on Styles in Chicago after a great match, and the heat was nuclear. Fans were genuinely pissed off that I had attacked my new partner, especially after such an excellent performance, thereby spoiling the potential of an AJ Styles, Chris Jericho team, and all the classic matches we could have had in the future. But the angriest of them all was the contingent of fans who'd been suckered into happily buying a t-shirt for a team that was together for less than a week. First of all, to those of you that did buy the Y2AJ shirt, I'm sorry you fell for it, but you have to admit that it was something diabolically different that helped get our angle over and added a shitload of intrigue to what we were about to do at WrestleMania, right? Secondly, if you still have the shirt, stop bitching and put it up for sale on eBay. After all, it's a limited edition rarity and probably worth a lot more than the $25 you paid for it. See, my turning heel could actually make you money. Chapter 13, the America's Funniest Home Videos Principle. Let it go. Don't be afraid to lose what was never meant to be. Nelson after the rain. A toddler swings a plastic baseball bat into his unsuspecting father's plums. An overweight auntie breaks a chair when she sits down at the family cookout. A dog and cat play catch with a bocce ball. All of these scenarios are hilariously cheesy or cheesily hilarious, depending on what side of the entertainment coin you're on, and all of them are trademarks of one of the longest-running American television institutions in the world today. I'm talking about America's Funniest Home Videos. Whether you've seen original host Bob Saget troll the audience with his brutal puns and nerdy demeanor, or his successor Tom Bergeron's more subdued, smooth charm and dry, subtle humor, we've all watched at least one episode. As a matter of fact, I used to watch AFV all the time. I just never thought I'd almost end up hosting the damn thing. But that's what happened when Bergeron announced he was leaving the show after 15 seasons in 2015, and through a set of strange, extenuating circumstances, I was courted by show creator Vin DeBona to be the new face of the franchise. At first, I wasn't sure about it, but I quickly realized I had what it took to be the new kid on the block, and I ain't talking about Jordan Knight. It was a massive opportunity, as being the host of the iconic AFV would give me a chance to sit at the top of the syndicated television totem pole. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so in the words of the mighty Kick-Axe, shout out to Kearns and Fitz, let's go back to the beginning. After so many flirtations with mainstream primetime gigs, from competing on Dancing with the Stars to hosting the ABC game show Downfall, the Sci-Fi Channel competition show Robot Combat League, and the Fuse TV singing show Redemption Song, I felt it was only a matter of time before something big came up and helped me break fully into the Hollywood big leagues. When I was approached by DeBona's reps about the possibilities of hosting AFV, I was kind of surprised. A few months prior, I had met with an executive at Disney named Dan Cohen, whose wife was a bigwig at AFV, which I assumed was the connection here. It reminded me that there was never a meeting too small to take in Hollywood, because you never know who you might meet or how it might pay off. I had my initial meeting with Vin and a few of his producers at a popular restaurant in West Hollywood. Since I'd been given word by my Disney contact that Vin was looking for a younger, more contemporary host than the previous one, I decided to forego the typical sports coat suit uniform of the average Hollywood wannabe and went with a classic Jericho scarf vest combo that was more David Lee Roth than Gene Rayburn. My plan worked, as Vin and I had a fun, easy-flowing conversation about the show, 50s crooners, and 60s singer-songwriters who played guitar and sang at the same time. We talked about Battle of the Network Stars, a 70s celebrity sports competition show that I loved when I was a kid, and classic cars. I faked my way through a debate as to whether a 1967 SS427 Camaro was better than a 1970 Z28 quite admirably, if I do say so myself. A few hours later, I got a call from Dan saying that on behalf of the group and himself, I had passed the audition, at least the first round of it. Vin was convinced I had the charm to take over the reins of his 25-year-old franchise and was interested in organizing a follow-up meeting. Even though it was made very clear to me that Vin was also talking to other people about hosting the show, it was nice to know that I was on the short list of DeBona. I couldn't resist. Over the next few months, I attended further lunches, sat in on a panel discussion on the future of social media held by Berkeley University. Vin was on the board of directors. Had countless AFV-related phone calls, and even invited Vin to SummerSlam to watch my match against Bray Wyatt. After all that, I was really starting to believe that I might be the chosen one. With each meeting, it became clearer to me that I could do the gig better than anybody else, and all my years of show business training had led me to the brink of landing the job of a lifetime. I felt that nobody else could match my combination of experience, improbability, on-camera comfortability, worldwide fan base, and rugged good looks that were important to distinguish Chris Jericho from both previous AFV hosts and its almost outdated image. In the meantime, my agent Barry Bloom and my lawyers negotiated with ABC and Vin's lawyers on the finer points of the deal, aka how much they were going to pay me per episode. When the dust settled, a deal was agreed upon, but not yet signed, that would see me making close to 7 figures for just 3 weeks of work per season. I couldn't have been happier, and I was ready for my close-up, Mr. DeBona. I was starting to settle into the notion that the gig was actually going to be mine when I began hearing some odd comments from one of the AFV execs. In a way, he kind of let it slip that ABC had already chosen their preferred host, and that host wasn't me. Around this time, I started hearing rumors about who that network-approved host might be. There were 2 names in particular that kept popping up, both of whom were familiar to me because I'd worked with them in the past. The first was Mario Lopez, who had rubbed me the wrong way whenever we met for years, culminating with a war of wills during a punishing round of Twister Hoopla on the Ellen DeGeneres show. Read the whole story in my classic parable, The Best in the World at What I Have No Idea. The second was Alfonso Ribeiro, with whom I'd clashed on my ill-fated stint on the awful Fox singing show Celebrity Duets 10 years prior. Drinking that whole story in my award-winning modern-day morality play, Undisputed. Knowing I was up against those mutton heads made me want to throw up in my mouth a little. If I didn't get the gig, I didn't get the gig, but please, not to one of those guys. Then I was summoned to LA to host an actual episode of the show in front of a live audience, and I knew that this was the chance I was waiting for to show what I could really do. This wasn't me standing in for a scene or two either. This was a fully produced, airable episode that was to take place right after a Tom Bergeron hosted taping. But in a When It Rains Sharks It Pours moment, I'd also been cast as Bruce the ride attendant in Sharknado 3, the 3rd installment of the immensely popular Sci-Fi Channel C-grade horror series. It was a good role, and I knew there would be huge press behind it due to the buzz the previous 2 films had garnered. The only drawback was that I was supposed to film my scenes on the same day I was required for rehearsals for the AFV screen test. With shrewd planning by Barry Bloom and some luck in making my flights, I finished my 2 days on set at Universal Studios in Orlando at 2 p.m., then headed straight to the airport to catch a 4 p.m. plane to LAX to make my 9 p.m. rehearsal. But it was worth making Sharknado happen, as it was a tremendous experience, and I got to work with some great people, including leading man Ian Ziering, who advised me how to get eaten by a CGI shark, flail as much as possible so the computer programmers had to make the shark's movements more grandiose, and my childhood crush Kim Richards, escape from Witch Mountain like a motherfucker. I landed at LAX at 8:30 p.m. and went straight to the studio. Vin was waiting for me and meticulously led me through the camera blocking for the segments I'd be hosting and explained what would be expected of me the following evening. He also gave me an acoustic guitar and suggested I sing a song during the tapings, as he wanted me to stand out in any way possible and thought if I came up with a pretty little ditty to sing for the audience, it might be fun. I hadn't played guitar and sung at the same time since high school, and I wasn't a James Hetfield level musician who could do that easily, but in the fine Hollywood tradition of never saying no to anything, I told him it was a great idea and that I was going to change my stage name to Elvis Jericho when I was done. I remember reading when Sting, and I ain't talking about the guy in the makeup, was first learning to play and sing at the same time, he wrote songs with space in between the chords so he can concentrate solely on his vocals. Example, Walking on the Moon. In that spirit, I worked up a tune using hanging power chords and a staccato rhythm change that enabled me to play while I sang my brilliant lyrics, which went something like this. Now it is time for America's funniest videos. Fun for your friends and your parents and your kiddios. So watch with me now, and in laughter we will join as we watch little kids hit their dads in the groin. Not exactly Dylan's Tangled Up in Blue, I know, but it fit the vibe of the show and worked perfectly well for what I was trying to accomplish. Vin got a laugh out of it as well and made no bones about the fact that I was his front runner for the job. I want you to get this gig, he said to me in a matter-of-fact tone. His words gave me confidence, but in the back of my mind, a worm of doubt was burrowing because I wondered, what does he mean by want? If he's the boss and he wants me to get the gig, why doesn't he just give it to me? At that point, it was clear that he wasn't the only one making the final decisions, and I still had some convincing to do for the holdouts in the Lopez Ribeiro camps. Then he asked if I minded covering the Fozzie F tattoo on my left hand because he didn't want to give anybody an excuse not to hire you as the host. Apparently, there were some evil overlords who were looking for any reason not to choose me, but it was now my mission to erase their inhibitions. The next night, I paced the floor of my dressing room before the big show, wearing a John Varvatos suit, no tie, too stuffy for the image I wanted to portray, and practicing my song. A parade of well-wishers came in to give me last-minute thumbs up and words of encouragement, including Tom Bergeron himself, who I knew from my time on Dancing with the Stars. Just be yourself and have fun, he advised, and that's exactly what I did. After Tom's taping was finished, I stood in the wings as the announcer explained to the audience that there was one more episode to be filmed that day, featuring a guest host, Chris Jericho. My appearance had been kept under wraps the whole night, so it was a surprise to the crowd when my name was announced. Thankfully, there was a coterie of Jerichoholics in attendance who gave me a great reception that quickly spread around the studio when people figured out I was somebody and they didn't want to be left out of the fun. Throughout the next hour, I ran that damn show like I was Johnny Carson in 1975. I kept people entertained, made them laugh when it was required, and quieted them down when it was time to watch the videos. My Elvis Jericho Pretty Little Ditty, and I ain't talking about the Red Hot Chili Peppers, went over big, especially when I used my Fozzie frontman skills to lead the crowd in a clapping sing-along. Vin had encouraged me to break the invisible wall between the host and the audience, so I prowled the stage telling jokes, giving fans high fives, and even sitting on the lap of a hefty African-American lady who was screaming and clapping for me like I was Hercules from the Nutty Professor. "You're my favorite host, Jericho. I hope you get the job," she repeated excitedly, while her husband took pictures of us on his iPhone. I was a hit with those two, and most of the rest of the audience as well, and I felt like I'd nailed it. I've always been overcritical of everything I do. I still don't care for my 1999 Raw debut promo with The Rock, but at the time on that night, I knew I'd killed it and wouldn't have changed a thing. My prospective boss apparently felt the same way as he grabbed me in a bear hug when I walked off stage with the cheers of the crowd still ringing in the studio. "Excellent, Chris. You made me proud." I hugged him back and thanked him for the opportunity, then walked back to my dressing room to process what had just happened. Barry joined me a few minutes later, and we jumped up and down in celebration like a couple of Star Wars nerds who had just found an advanced copy of Episode 8. It was one of the best nights of my professional career for about another 7 minutes. Barry and I were in the midst of our Dagobah dance when one of the AFV higher-ups, not Vin, barged in, babbling so rapidly and incoherently that I can only assume he was coked up. "You did a good job, Chris, but ABC has already made their decision, and the guy they chose just blew them away from the start, so it's too bad, but they thought he was just great, and it's pretty much a done deal, but thanks for coming out." And the person continued speed rambling as I mouthed to Barry, "What the hell is he talking about?" The yayo kid finished the tirade and bounced out the door, but at that point, my buzz had been killed, brought back to life by Melisandre, and then killed again. I should have felt triumphant, but after that asshole's rambling, I just wanted to go to bed. The next day, I shrugged off the previous night's bad vibes and went to a recording studio to track voiceovers for my episode. They took a little more time than I would have liked, as Vin was watching over my shoulder, having me repeat the lines until he got the exact take he was looking for, right down to each syllable. He reminded me a lot of Vince McMahon because he knew precisely what he wanted, and he wasn't going to be satisfied until he got it. I eventually gave him what he was looking for, and the first of what hopefully would be many episodes of America's Funniest Videos, hosted by Chris Jericho, was complete. When I left the studio, I didn't know if I had gotten the gig, but I knew I had done all I could, and there was nothing left to do but wait. And wait. And wait. Over the next 2 months, the only word I received was that I was indeed a finalist for the job, along with Ribeiro Lopez. Finally, 8 weeks later, the phone rang, and I saw the name Vin DeBona on the screen. I ran up the stairs into my office and answered nervously, "Hey, Vin, how are you?" "I'm good, Chris." Fuck. I knew by his tone that I hadn't gotten the gig. "I just wanted to call you myself and tell you that we've decided to go with somebody else as the new host of AFV. Ugh, I knew it. I felt like I'd been kicked in the ball bag by Braun Strowman. Now, I don't take no for an answer in most cases, but I also know when the time comes to accept defeat and step back. I knew the AF train had left the station, and there was nothing I could do to change Vin's decision. I could beg him for a second chance or demand to know the reason why I didn't get chosen, but I knew it was better just to take it like a man and get off the phone. Besides, it was pointless to ask him what I could have done differently or who got the job instead of me, because it really didn't matter. However, before I could hang up with my dignity intact, Vin continued with a few more details. We've decided to go with somebody with a little more comedic experience, someone who can handle the voiceovers, angry author's note, fuck those fucking voiceovers, a little differently than you did. You really did a great job, and I think there are going to be some opportunities for us to work together again in the future. I'll be in touch in about a month. Okay, Vin, thanks for the opportunity, and hopefully we can talk soon. I hung up the phone and saw that the time of the call was 1 minute and 48 seconds. 14 months of schmoozing, phone calls, meetings, and auditions had been boiled down to a 108-second rejection notice. I was pissed off because I truly felt that AFV had been my gig to lose, and I'd lost it. I went downstairs and poured myself a yeah boy and didn't stop at one. I was filled with a dozen different emotions, including self-doubt, loss, and frustration. The phone call had shaken me more than anything else in my 43 years of existence. My professional depression, cool song title, deepened a few weeks later when I was at a Rush concert in Houston and got the news that Alfonso Ribeiro had officially gotten the job. I read his statement online while Geddy Lee laid down the bass line to Roll the Bones, where he promised to bring new energy to the show and to even perform the Carlton dance from time to time. Seriously, that's the last thing I needed to hear. I hated that fucking thing when he did it 20 years earlier on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and it hadn't gotten any better since. After the Ribeiro announcement, I was barraged by a mix of emotions, including jealousy, anger, and revenge. Thoughts of calling Speewee to plant a bag of cocaine in Alfonso's car ran briefly through my mind. But once the news came out, it felt better to have closure, and at least I could take solace in the fact that I had beaten Mario Lopez. Technically, I suppose he could have been the first runner-up, but in my mind, I had blown him away, and it's my book, so deal with it. More importantly, I started to let the poison sting of rejection fade away. There was no reason to continue to second-guess myself because I knew I had done everything within my ability to get the gig. I gave the best performance I could have, and the rest was out of my hands. It was time to let it go. To help me get over the rejection, I asked the advice of some of my veteran showbiz friends, including William Shatner, who said if I dwelled upon every gig I didn't get, I would have quit showbiz after a year. He was in his 7th decade in the business, so I figured he knew what he was talking about and took his words to heart. My Sharknado simpatico, Ian Ziering, told me a similar story about how he lost the Price is Right hosting gig to Drew Carey a few years earlier. You can't let it bring you down, man. It wasn't meant to be, which means there's another gig out there for you that is. My friends were right. I decided to let AFV go for good, and subsequently it became just another gig in a sea of gigs I didn't get. But somewhere in a dusty warehouse in New Mexico, lying on a shelf beside the Ark of the Covenant, there's a locked wooden box with a tape inside of an episode of America's Funniest Videos hosted by Chris Jericho. Epilogue. While I was writing this very chapter, after not hearing from Vin for 16 months, I got a call from his office asking about possibly doing another project together. To be continued. Chapter 14, The Mike Lazansky Principle. Stand up for what you believe in. Get up, stand up for your rights. Bob Marley, get up, stand up. A few months before I moved from Winnipeg to Calgary to train with the Hart Brothers, I was hanging out at the local strip club down the street from my house called The Ville. The place was as classy as it sounds, darkly lit with fake wood-paneled walls that reeked of stale smoke and cheap beer. However, due to the wonders of fake IDs, my friends and I had been hanging out there since we were 15 years old. So even though it was a shithole, it was our shithole. That night, a DJ who resembled Bob Ross was playing the hot tunes of the fall of '89, including healthy doses of Guns N' Roses, Roxette, Alana Miles, and the Northern Pikes. There's some Canadiana for you. While walking the floor with a cordless mic asking the scattered patrons random questions in between dances. He stuck the mic in the face of a guy who looked exactly like Barney Gumble and asked, "My man, what do you want Shelly Sensation to do tonight?" "Take your clothes off," Barney screamed at the top of his lungs to nobody in particular. Considering we were in a peeler joint, it was a fair request. But it just so happened that I'd been staring at said Shelly Sensation from the moment she got on stage, and she'd looked back at me a few times with a beguiling smile. Now keep in mind that Canadian strip clubs are different than American ones, as instead of hanging around all night hustling for dances, the stripper does 4 onstage shows a day consisting of 4 songs each. When her show is over, she leaves the premises until the next show, which is usually 2 or 3 hours later. That meant if I didn't approach Shelly as soon as she left the stage, I wouldn't see her again for hours. So I power walked over as she slid a silk robe onto her amazingly toned, naked body and chatted her up. She seemed engaged enough, so it didn't seem out of line to ask her for her number. I mean, she obviously wasn't there to make money, but to hook up with goofy-ass teenagers, right? But my bubble was burst when she said, I'd give you my number, but my boyfriend probably wouldn't like it. He's a pro wrestler too. She said pro wrestler too because I had told her I was a professional wrestler, not that I was going to wrestling school in a few months. But that's nitpicking, isn't it? Besides, I wanted to know who this fancy pants wrestler boyfriend was, so I asked her his name. I'm dating Mike Lazansky, she said with a smile. Well, that changed everything. I knew who Mike Lazansky was because I'd seen him on TV wrestling for the local Winnipeg promotion run by Tony Condello. Not only was he a good-looking guy and a pretty good wrestler, but he was banging this gorgeous stripper too. I decided right then I wouldn't mind meeting this Lazansky cat and learning a thing or two from him. I ended up meeting him a few months later after I finished wrestling school through Brett Como, a talented performer who had also been on Condello's TV. I hit it off with both of them instantly, and they took me under their wings right from the start. Brett was a sarcastic rocker dude like me, but Mike was a charismatic schmoozer who made friends with almost everybody he met. He had big league confidence with the touch of arrogance needed to get out of the local Calgary scene and make it to the next level. And that's what he did. With only a few years in the business under his belt, Mike had already wrestled in New Zealand, Japan, Mexico, all across Canada, and over a dozen states. He also came from a wealthy family, which meant he didn't have to worry about how much he was getting paid or what expenses he might incur along the way. That was the perfect situation for Como and me because Mike paid for all of our gas and food bills whenever we traveled together. The drawback to that was it meant that Mike called the shots. If he wanted to drive all night or stop for food or head to the ghetto looking for weed, as described in my true crime novel, A Lion's Tale, Como and I would have to follow him. But it wasn't such a bad deal because we got to drive across the country and work in places like northern British Columbia and southern California, which most of the other guys in Calgary didn't have the chance to. I felt bad about that at times and even asked Mike if my tag team partner Lance Storm could join us for a 36-hour drive to a show in Pomona, California. Listen, Chris, you're not going to be a tag team forever, so you need to take the bookings you can get and not worry about your partner. I felt bad relaying that to Lance, even though he understood and had no problem with it. It was Mike's decision and I had to go along with it, just as it was Mike's decision for us to drive across the continent to work a television taping in Wichita, Kansas. When we arrived in Wichita, we found out that the promoter, Christopher Love, wasn't all that he claimed to be. In fact, he was full of shit. He had surrounded himself with a ragtag collection of yes men and cronies who boasted about how big they were in the business, even though I hadn't heard of a single one of them. I had a bad vibe about the place to begin with, which got worse when Love decided at the last second that he didn't want to use Como. He claimed it was because Brett was too small, even though he'd seen pictures of all three of us and knew exactly what he was getting when he agreed to bring us in. Mike was furious. Love had made him look bad because he had gotten the three of us booked, and after the marathon journey we'd gone through to get there, he wasn't able to deliver the opportunity he'd promised. Brett told him pretty much right away that he didn't give a shit and had no problem with the two of us still doing the show, but Mike wasn't having it. No fucking way. Love promised to use the three of us, so either we all work or none of us do. I did a mental double take at Mike's words because I had made that long drive and dealt with all the bullshit to get to Wichita as well, so I wasn't as keen on just turning around and going home without taking advantage of the opportunity. I mean, what if I had a good match that ended up on TV and got me more bookings in America? Working in the States was a rare thing for me at that time, and I didn't want to let this chance slip away. If it had been up to me, I would have worked the show and given Como half my payoff, but to Mike, this wasn't about the money. It was about standing up for what he believed in. He'd been lied to, which to him was unacceptable, so now we were going to stick together. I eventually saw his point and backed him when he told Love he was going to have to use all three of us or none of us at all. Fine, then the three of you can fuck off back to Canada. I don't really give a shit, the fat bastard snarled. So we fucked off back to Canada empty-handed and matchless. But we left Kansas with our heads held high and smiles on our faces because we had stuck together and stood up for what we felt was right. And that was a damn good feeling. Unfortunately, Mike and I grew apart over the years, and even though he had some success working as Mike Anthony in Memphis, ECW, and WCW, we really didn't cross paths too often before he passed away at just 35 years old in 2003. I felt awful when I found out about his death because I should have reached out to him and been a better friend during the problematic latter stages of his life. But I still think about him often because he was a big influence in the early days of my career, and I might not have made it as far as I did without him, his friendship, and the lesson he taught me in Wichita back in 1991. Thanks, Mikey. Mike's concept of standing up for what you believe in has come up time and time again in my WWE career, but most recently in 2016 when I was working with AJ Styles. As we discussed earlier in this fine compendium, I was really excited to wrestle AJ when he first signed with the company. He was a tremendous performer with a dazzling array of offense, but I found it odd that whenever he won a match, it was always with the top rope phenomenal forearm or the calf crusher submission, despite the fact that his Styles Clash finish was already really popular and synonymous with him. Whenever he teased the Styles Clash, people went banana, Pat Patterson trademark, with anticipation, only to be let down when the move was thwarted. So when I suggested we use the Clash as the actual finish to one of our matches, I was told that it had been unofficially banned by Vince. Someone had brought it to his attention that a few guys had supposedly been hurt by the move, even though it was one of the easiest bumps I would ever take in my career. Mr. Saka was the easiest by far. But here's how it worked. AJ would pick up his opponent like he was going to give him a pile driver, but instead of sitting down, he would simply fall forward and faceplant the guy. So you would land mostly on your chest and knees, but the illusion would be that your face had been smashed into the mat. It was a piece of piss to take and a great move, so I decided I would make it my mission to get it unbanned. When we worked our third match at the Fast Break pay-per-view, I thought it was the perfect opportunity to bust it out in the WWE for the first time and show Vince that it wasn't as dangerous as he had heard. If it was safe enough for one of his top guys to take, then it must be okay for everybody else, right? Since this was one of AJ's established finishes, I didn't want to just take it and kick out with no merit, so he came up with an idea where he'd hit me with it and I'd barely kick out, only to have him roll me right into the calf crusher for the tap-out victory. In the fine tradition of a principle that didn't make the book, it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission, I figured if Vince really didn't want us to use the move, we would hear about it after. Thankfully, he didn't say anything because it was a safe-looking what a maneuver that got a massive reaction from the crowd. It also got a massive negative reaction from the internet smart mark contingent, who accused me of taking the Styles Clash just so I could kick out of it and continue AJ's quote-unquote WWE burial. You should have heard how outraged they were when I actually pinned him at WrestleMania. Apparently, it was the worst decision since Hillary deleted her emails. In reality, my strategy wasn't to kick out of the Clash to bury AJ, but to take the move on camera so that Vince would see with his own two eyes, and I ain't talking about fairies wear boots, just how safe it was. Step one of my plan worked because we didn't get any flack, and it was treated as just another great false finish in a match full of them. The second step of the plan was to use it again as a near fall in front of over 100,000 fans at WrestleMania 32 in Dallas. Once again, we built the match to the perfect point, so when AJ hit the Clash, the crowd exploded. They were sure it was the finish until I kicked out at 2.999 seconds, leading to another huge pop, this one of disappointment. It worked perfectly, and my mission of clearing the good name of the Styles Clash was almost complete. The perfect chance to finish what I started, and I ain't talking about Eddie Van Halen, presented itself the next night when the main event of Raw was a fatal four-way between me, AJ, Cesaro, and Kevin Owens to decide the number one contender for the WWE Championship. The finish was AJ over me, and that's when I knew the time was right to strike. I went into Vince's office to pitch the finish, but there was one very important rule I had to remember. I could not use the name Styles Clash at any time. I had a hunch that while Vince might be against the theoretical move called the Styles Clash, he also might not know exactly what it was. But since he had already seen the move, as I had taken it twice already on camera, that would mean he would know what I was talking about if I described it without actually calling it by name. Vince, do you remember the move we used at Mania yesterday where AJ picked me up like a pile driver, but just fell forward and pancaked my face instead? Of course, I got a great reaction. Yeah, it did. That's why I think we should use it as the finish tonight. It's easy, it's over, and it can add another weapon to AJ's arsenal. I love it. Let's do it. There you have it. AJ pinned me with it later that night, and biggity bam, the Styles Clash was officially back in business thanks to yours truly. So, constant reader, whenever you see AJ use it, including when he gave it to Roman Reigns on the floor a few months later, holla at your boy Jericho. And to all the internet smarks who threw so much shade at me the first time I kicked out of it, I accept your apology and hope you've learned your lesson, you stupid idiots. On November 13th, 2015, there was a brutal attack in Paris where ISIS terrorists initiated multiple bombings and shootings, killing 130 people in total, with 89 of them being at an Eagles of Death Metal concert inside a venue called the Bataclan. That attack caused great unrest among European rock fans, and I knew this because I was there. Fozzy had played a gig the same night in Rotterdam, Netherlands, only 285 miles away from Paris. Even more chilling was the fact that we had a Paris gig of our own scheduled for exactly 1 week later. The entire country was in mass chaos, and it was a difficult time to be touring in Europe. As a band, we were in a difficult position. On one hand, all of our families wanted us to come home, and the fact that a slew of big bands had already canceled their European shows didn't strengthen our case. Within days, U2, Motorhead, Lamb of God, and Papa Roach all postponed their tours and got the hell out of Dodge. And while we considered doing the same, Rich and I eventually decided we didn't want to do that to our fans. In this difficult time, people needed something to take their minds off the tragedy, so what would it help to cancel our shows and give the terrorists another small win over the world? In the end, we made a unanimous decision as a band to stand up for what we believe in and continue the tour. The following week wasn't easy. There was an eerie feeling at every show leading up to Paris, and attendance was understandably way down, as the last thing a lot of people wanted to do was go to a rock show. It all came to a head that Friday when we showed up for our concert at Le Forum in Varial, a suburb of Paris. I was a little freaked out playing in France only 7 days after the tragedy, but I let go of those thoughts quickly the moment I hit the stage. We had a band discussion before the gig and decided it didn't matter how many people showed up, they were going to get one hell of a rock show. Fozzy's motto of 10 or 10,000 never meant as much to us as it did that night. We had a job to entertain the fans and help them forget this tragedy, and we were going to do that to the best of our abilities no matter who came. When our set began, I was pleasantly surprised to see a couple hundred fans in the room and happy to hear they were a loud crowd right from the start. These Fozzy fanatics were truly hardcore, ready for a good time, and so were we. The show went by smoothly, with the highlight being the minute of noise we requested for the fallen Parisians. Let me just say those 200 people sounded like 20,000 as they roared as loud as they could for 60 seconds. It was such an emotional moment and was as deep a connection to an audience as I've ever felt. What made the night even more special was how many of our fans thanked us for playing the show. They were genuinely appreciative of the fact that we had shown the balls to not cancel, even in the face of potential danger. It reminded me of when I toured Iraq with the WWE 3 years running to visit the U.S. military and spent the entire time having soldiers of all ages tell me how much it meant to them that the WWE had come to see them. They were the ones who were living through the horrors of war, but we were the ones being treated like heroes. That night at Le Forum gave me the same feeling, especially after our encounter with Lionel, who was working at the venue as our backstage assistant for the day. His job was to stock the dressing room with food, hook up our Wi-Fi, bring us towels or ice, and basically take care of anything we needed. He was a fun guy who spoke fairly good English, and we had some brief conversations, but it wasn't until after the show that I learned he had been trapped in the Bataclan 7 days earlier. Lionel was watching the Eagles of Death Metal show when the shooting started and ended up barricading himself with a group of others in an upstairs room by pushing a refrigerator against the door. He and 12 other potential victims waited in total silence for the next 3 hours as the gunshots cracked outside the door. He even had to lean into the fridge to hold it in place at one point as the terrorists tried to force their way into the room. Eventually, the attackers moved on, choosing to continue the massacre elsewhere. But what surprised me the most was after that horrible experience, Lionel was back at another concert just 1 week later. I didn't understand how he could do that. I have to. This is my job, and I love music, he said with a heavy accent. And if I don't come to work tonight or I miss out on seeing Fozzy, the terrorists would then take something else from me, and I wasn't going to let that happen. I praised him for standing up for what he believed in, and he reciprocated. It means everything to your fans in Paris that you played tonight, even for the ones who didn't come. Thank you for making us happy in this terrible time. All I can say is, merci d'être là now. C'est un honneur de jouer pour vous, les gens marveleux de Paris. Google it. Thanks to Kevin Owens for that translation. Chapter 15, the Ted Irvine Principle. You gotta sell yourself. Hunger. I want it so bad I can taste it. It drives me mad to see it wasted. Kickaxe. Hunger. When I started thinking about getting into the wrestling business, my dad gave me a piece of crucial advice. You have to sell yourself. When you're starting out, no one's going to pick up the phone and call you. you have to be the one to call them. I can affirm all these years later that he was absolutely right. You got to sell yourself, man. I'm not sure if this was his mindset when he was breaking into the NHL or just what he came to believe after his pro hockey career was over, but the bottom line, because Stone Ted said so, was that his message was driven into my head earlier in my career, and I've heeded that advice ever since. That's why after only a few months in the business, despite my obvious inexperience, I started making highlight videos of my matches using the best high spots I could call from grainy, jumpy VHS recordings. Then I wrote up a resume listing the meager 3 companies I'd worked for, along with my college degree info. For a reference, I included the name of the manager at the IGA grocery store where I'd worked my last real job, as I'm sure my skills as a meat slicer were just what Vince McMahon was looking for. Maybe I was hoping to get that coveted Donnie Deli gimmick. I sent that tape and resume to every promoter I had an address for, including guys in New Zealand, Australia, and Greenland, some of whom, unbeknownst to me, hadn't run shows since the 70s. Even when I received no reply, and I ain't talking about the Beatles, or got the packages sent back returned to sender, and I ain't talking about Elvis, at least I was trying to get something rolling and not just sitting on my ass waiting for the phone to ring. I wasn't ignored completely, as I did get a letter back from the Texas-based Global Wrestling Federation. When I ecstatically opened the envelope, I found what was basically a wrestling version of a Dear John letter from Booker Bill Eadie. But there was a silver lining, because even though he wasn't interested in bringing me in, he was very complimentary of my tape and told me I had potential. I've still never met Mr. Eadie, but I'd like to thank him for taking the time to write that letter. His words were as powerful to me as Klaatu Varata Necto were to Ash Williams, because they gave me a modicum of confidence that my plan to get booked could work. I had taken a chance and put myself out there and had moved a step forward in return. But I know from experience that it's not always easy to sell yourself. It takes a lot of chutzpah to pick up the phone and tell somebody how valuable you are to their business or project, but it has to be done, even if they don't respond. You have to keep hammering on that door, no matter how exhausting or embarrassing it might be. You could change the lesson in this chapter to stay determined, or if you want something done, do it yourself, because both of those are basically saying the same thing. If you believe your plan is right, then stick with it. That's an ideal that I use on a micro level as well as a macro level. I employ it all the time to get my ideas across when putting together a match or writing a song. Once I get what I believe is a good idea in my head, I have no problem pushing it on whomever the hapless soul is who attempts to oppose me. Just ask The Big Show. Back in 2009, we were the best tag team in the business. The WWE called us Jericho, but I didn't like the name and never used it on TV once. And on certain nights when I referred to myself as the best in the world, I really meant it. I had a great sense of who my character was and how I wanted my matches to go. And even though my theory being part of a successful tag team means you should compromise, I didn't really do that. Whenever show had an invariably inferior idea, I would listen, nod my head, and calmly praise him. Then I would explain why my idea was better and wouldn't take no for an answer, see Chapter 5, until he agreed to do it my way. He always agreed, usually by throwing up his hands and stomping out of the room mumbling, "Fine, I'm just a big stupid giant. What do I know?" He still has no problem reminding me how my pit bull tenacity mentally exhausted him until he finally had to tap out and agree to do it my way. That was a smart move, because my way usually was the right way. That's half the battle when it comes to selling yourself. You have to commit, Chapter 11, to whatever you're selling. People have to believe that what you are proposing is a must-see, no-brainer, and they can't live their lives without it or you. I once read that when John Travolta was still doing auditions at the beginning of his career, he went into the room with the mindset that he had gotten the part already. He just had to convince the casting directors that he was the only man for the job, and hiring anybody else was a foolhardy, Matt and Jeff's slow cousin, decision. I'm sure it's a lot easier for John Travolta in 2017 to think that way than it was for John Travolta in 1976 when he was walking into Brian De Palma's office to read for the part of Billy Nolan and Carrie. But like a young John, I believe you got to have that confidence no matter how early on you might be in your career, because you can't afford not to sell yourself at all times. As of this writing, I'm in my 17th year in the WWE, and even after all that time, I still discuss every segment I'm in with Vince, because if I don't and something goes awry, I'll get in trouble. Case in point, in 2013, I did a highlight reel with The Miz, Wade Barrett, and Brad Maddox that was a shipwreck from the get-go. It was poorly written, filled with bad comedy that got no reaction from the live audience, and included a weird clip from Barrett's new movie awkwardly sandwiched in the middle for no apparent reason. There was zero chemistry between the four of us. Maddox forgot his lines, and I made it worse with some bad improv. The whole thing came across forced and ended flat, and the only good thing about it was that it led to a triple threat match between me, Miz, and Barrett, which ended up pretty good. But when I got to the back afterwards, I was furious to find out that Vince had told announcer Michael Cole to call the highlight reel, and I quote, the worst segment in Raw history. That pissed me off big time, and after I blew up on poor Cole for merely repeating what our boss had told him to say, I confronted Vince. He made it clear to me that he thought the segment was rotten, and when I told him that it was doomed from the start because of the awkward concept and the poor writing, he got mad. Well, damn it, Chris, if you ever get something handed to you that you think sucks, you need to come discuss it with me so we can change it and make it better. He was absolutely right, and that's what I've done ever since. When I was starting my program with Dean Ambrose in 2016, I had a myriad of ideas about how to make the storyline more exciting. So at a Raw in St. Louis, I went into Vince's office to sell those ideas and myself to him, the first of which dealt with a potted plant. That's right, I said potted plant. Earlier that year, I had done a highlight reel with Ambrose and Roman Reigns, and as we were writing the segment, we were laughing about the declining quality of the highlight reel's production values over the years. Back in its glory days in the mid-2000s, the reel set included a large carpet painted with the silhouette of the classic Jericho pose in an eye-catching array of psychedelic colors, along with an obscenely expensive Geratron 5000 hanging from the ceiling, all bookended by a matching pair of Salvador Dali-looking set pieces that gave the whole thing the exact neoclassical bohemian vibe I was looking for. By 2016, it had been reduced to a plain black carpet, a dilapidated Geratron on a rickety stand, and a pair of bar stools straight out of Moe's Tavern. As a result, Ambrose joked that he should bring a potted plant to the ring to spruce the place up a bit. It was a subtle detail that thousands of fans picked up on and commented about on Twitter, even leading to someone, it wasn't me, creating the Twitter account of @Jericho's Potted Plant. Over the next few months, on every highlight reel, I made sure to include a potted plant as part of the set, because in the back of my mind, I envisioned eventually smashing it over somebody's head. I even pitched the idea of breaking it over AJ Styles' face before WrestleMania, which would force him to wear an eye patch for the big match. Vince didn't like that idea, but when I suggested shattering it over Ambrose's noggin, oh, the irony, he approved it wholeheartedly. So I laid out a plan where Ambrose would beat me in our first encounter at the Payback pay-per-view, and then I would break the plant over his head the next night, leading to a hospital stay that would cause him to miss SmackDown. Miffed author's note. One thing I hated was when the writers named the weed Mitch the Potted Plant. It took away from the seriousness of the beatdown and made the fans think it was cute to make memes and post tweets about how I murdered the perennial, rather than focus on the fact that I had put Ambrose in the hospital. I also pitched another idea I've been sitting on for years. Ever since I debuted my light-up jacket at the beginning of 2012, it had become a Jericho trademark, a late-career reinvention that made me stand out and had become an iconic part of my character. In the 5 years I'd been wearing the jackets, there are 4 in total, nobody had ever touched, threatened, or messed with them in any way. That's why I thought it was high time that somebody did. However, I didn't really want to destroy a garment that I'd paid 5 figures of my own hard-earned cash for. Fortunately, after wearing it for years on TV, I noticed there were always fans in the crowd wearing their own light-up jackets. Some of them were homemade and cheap-looking, but others were actually pretty good. I did some digging and found out that a company out of India was making replica Chris Jericho celebrity light-up jackets and selling them for the low, low price of $400, much cheaper than the $10,000 I'd spent on the original. They looked so much like the real deal that during a tour of Australia, when my jacket was barely lighting up and finally died altogether, I almost sent one of our security guys out to borrow one of the replicas from a Jerichoholic in the crowd. Then I nixed the idea. I mean, Paul Stanley would never ask a fan to lend him a replica KISS costume to wear on stage, would he? So instead, I had my opponent, Bray Wyatt, go to the ring and cut a promo threatening to beat up a fan in the front row. My music interrupted him, and I ran in to save the day and clean house with no jacket required, and I ain't talking about Phil Collins. I love the concept of somebody destroying the jacket, though, so I ordered one of the replicas for $400 and kept it in my closet, waiting for the right time to use it. When I started the program with Ambrose, I knew that with his quirkiness and lunatic fringe gimmick, he would be the perfect guy to destroy it. I proposed the idea to Vince as a way for Dean to extract his revenge for me smashing the pot over his head, and after smartly selling the concept, and once again myself, the boss signed off on that one too. One of the writers then came up with the idea of me putting Ambrose in a straitjacket as revenge for him destroying my property, and since I was on a roll, I pitched that as well. Another home run. Then came the big one. When Ambrose and head writer Dave Kapoor and I were trying to figure out what kind of a gimmick match we could have as the blow-off to the feud at the Extreme Rules pay-per-view, we didn't really have much. A straitjacket match seemed lame, a paddy wagon match would be boring, and cage matches and ladder matches seemed too played out. We were planning on a self-explanatory Extreme Rules match, but that was given to AJ Styles and Roman Reigns instead, so we were left holding the bag. We put our heads together and came up with the idea of the first ever Asylum match, a cage match with various weaponry hanging off the sides. We loved the idea of involving a variety of plunder that we could use to whack each other with at any time. I knew that Vince was a sucker for the first ever tagline, and with that in mind, I began my spiel. When I mentioned that the cage would have multiple weapons involved, Vince mumbled, "I should have known a normal cage match wouldn't be enough for you two." I ignored his comment and kept right on pitching. I went through the basic rules and the design. Painting the cage black was Ambrose's idea, and then hit him with my closing line that it would be the first ever Asylum match. Vince smiled knowingly and approved it on the spot. We shook hands, and I poured myself a coffee because, as Alec Baldwin says, coffee is for closers only. We discussed our thoughts on what kinds of weapons would be used. I wanted a chainsaw that Dean would use to cut the top rope in half and choke me with, but Vince declined. Then I brought up the possibility of thumbtacks. Vince laughed and said, "That's not going to happen." I didn't figure he'd go for it, but I knew Dean wanted to try to get them approved because he had planned to use them in his street fight against Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania 32 a few months earlier. However, Brock wasn't too keen on the concept, and the idea was quickly dropped. I, on the other hand, had no issue with using the tacks, since the plan was for me to beat Dean at the pay-per-view and then challenge Roman Reigns for the title. Therefore, if the tacks were allowed, Ambrose was the one who would have to do the hibbity-dibbity in them, not me. Over the next few weeks, the angle unfolded exactly as we had pitched, leading to some unforgettable moments. The destruction of my jacket was awesome, and instead of just wearing one of the other 3 light-up jackets to the ring, I switched over to just wearing the scarf. We were gearing up for the monumental Asylum blow-off match when I got a text from Ambrose telling me that Vince had approved the tacks. I was totally surprised, but also excited because I knew it would lead to an unforgettable image when Dean took that tack bump. But a funny thing happened on the way to the Asylum. Vince had changed his mind, what a surprise, and decided to make the returning Seth Rollins the new challenger to Roman Reigns' WWE Championship instead of me. As a result, the change was made for Ambrose to win the Asylum match, which made sense since it was his creation. But that meant if anyone was going to take the tack bump, it had to be me. But why would I, an established veteran with seemingly nothing to prove, take that diabolical bump? Well, constant reader, pull up a chair under the learning tree, Dusty Rhodes trademark, and let me explain to you a little something about wrestling psychology. Vince hadn't allowed a thumbtack bump in over a decade, which meant the majority of our fans had never seen such a barbaric spectacle before. And let's be honest, the whole concept of falling onto a bed of sharp objects that pierce your skin and leave you bleeding like a human pincushion is pretty fucking barbaric, like feeding Christians to the lions type stuff. Therefore, the concept of the tack bump had to be protected and sold like it was the absolute worst, most painful thing that could ever happen to a WWE superstar, and I'm going to tell you why. No matter how much of a wrestling fan you are, you'll never really know how it feels to take a body slam or a suplex. You can guess how much pain you'd be in, but you'll never truly know for sure. Therefore, when you see your heroes take this type of punishment on TV, it's never going to resonate with you in a realistic way. However, everybody knows what it feels like to get stuck by a sharp object, whether it's a shot at the doctors or a bee sting, and we all know it really hurts. No matter your age, rank, or serial number, everyone's reaction to the prick of a needle is the same. I don't want to get that shot because it's going to hurt when that needle goes into my skin. In the case of the tack bump, if you take the pain of a soul doctor's needle and multiply it by 50, I guarantee there isn't one normal human being on the planet who would willingly allow themselves to be put in that situation. However, pro wrestlers aren't normal human beings, and I'm not a normal pro wrestler. All that the critics and fans said after the match was, Jericho has nothing to prove and at 45 years old did not need to take that bump. Well, guess what? They're all wrong because I did need to take that bump. Because that is what was best for the match. If Ambrose took the bump and then went on to beat me, the whole point, pun intended, of using the tacks would have been wasted. It would insinuate to the fans that the tacks really didn't hurt, and it was just another stunt in a show filled with many of them. Not on my watch. Much like a musician who plays what fits best for the song rather than showing off, think Phil Rudd and AC/DC, I knew that I would have to take the damn bump in the tacks and get pinned directly after, not because I wanted to, but because it made the most sense for the story of the match. It was also what was best for Dean Ambrose, because after months of being referred to as the lunatic fringe, and I ain't talking about Tom Cochran, he hadn't done anything all that loony. But now he would be known as the psycho who dumped his opponent in a pile of thumbtacks and laughed about it after. Honestly, I kind of got off on the idea of taking the fall as well, because after being in the business for 25 years, I'd never taken a thumbtack bump before. I'd also never gotten hit with a fluorescent light bulb or had my head stuck into a bucket filled with piranhas, but at least this made sense and put over my opponent in a way that others hadn't. I made up my mind I was going to do it, and that was that. Plus, in the Grand Jericho tradition of always selling myself, I knew that because the bump hadn't been done in so long, it would be one of the most memorable parts of the show and be talked about for years after. That in turn would up my profile, my fan base, and my status. See, selling yourself isn't always as simple as just picking up the phone. Sometimes you're going to get slammed into some thumbtacks to get what you want, yo. The Asylum match was kind of plotting, but when Dean grabbed a velvet bag out of a bucket hanging from the top of the cage and poured the contents in the middle of the ring, the sold-out crowd in Newark, New Jersey gave a 15,000-person collective gasp, which is exactly what we were hoping for. We teased the bump a few times over the next few minutes, with each of us narrowly getting out of harm's way until I eventually locked the walls onto Dean. The crowd roared in approval until Dean escaped by giving me a few well-placed kendo stick shots. I turned the tide with a couple of barbed wire 2x4 shots into his abdomen and then attempted to give him a code breaker. However, he caught me in midair, turned to his right, and powerbombed me right into the hundreds of shiny silver thumbtacks. When I landed, I thought of Leonardo DiCaprio in Titanic talking about jumping into water that was so cold it hits you like 1,000 knives, stabbing you all over your body. You can't breathe. You can't think about anything but the pain. Well, that pretty much nails, or should I say tacks, how I felt. I couldn't breathe with all the pain shooting through my body. It wasn't a deep agony that would be long-lasting, but more of a steady throbbing that felt like dozens of bees stinging me simultaneously. I rose up out of the tack bath, screaming in torment with my arms outstretched in a hardcore Jesus Christ pose, just as somebody snapped a picture. That photo ended up being used in dozens of hilarious and clever memes over the next few weeks, with my faves being me jumping in the air with the Beatles in 1964, getting shot out of a cannon at a circus, being chased by Hitchcock's birds, and rocking out in the back of the car with the Wayne's World gang. But the mirth of the memes aside, the worst part was trying to stand up after landing on my back. I felt like a turtle trying to turn over as I couldn't plant my hand down anywhere to push my body up due to the pounding prick of my new tacky friends. I couldn't bend my legs either because I had so many of the little fuckers in the waistline of my street fighting jeans — it was an Extreme Rules match after all — that I was afraid they would stab me and add to my increasing collections of piercings. I shuffled, rolled around until I was able to get to my knees, all the while screaming uncontrollably to sell the severity of the bump, and then turned into Ambrose's Dirty Deeds DDT finish. As I took the move, I put my hands up to protect my face, and while I succeeded in not having any of the tacks stuck into my mug, 3 of the little bastards poked through the palm of my hand, and let me tell you, that led to some really serious pain. I felt like a lion with 3 splinters in his paw, crying and writhing in agony as I rolled over so Dean could pin me. In the process, I had to arch my lower back up off the mat to avoid getting stabbed by the renegade tacks still residing in my britches. The crowd popped huge when he got the win, and he left the ring the triumphant hero who proved he was indeed the lunatic fringe he claimed to be. After all, he had barbarically brutalized great thrash metal album title, his hated rival, in a way nobody else had in over a decade. Meanwhile, I was left alone in the ring with 68 tacks sticking out of my bleeding body, with the 3 most painful ones jammed into my hand. That trio of pushpins was giving me so much agony that I decided to make sure the world knew they were there. I looked towards the camera, whimpering pathetically in torment, and held my wounded hand next to my face with the palm towards the lens, giving the world a close-up of my anguish. And why did I go out of my way to get that shot on camera? Because, say it with me now, kids, I was selling myself. Epilogue. After having a total of 68 tacks removed from my back, shoulders, and elbows by the WWE doctors and trainers, every one of them caught on camera, of course, I went to the dressing room to take off my boots. I sat down, but recoiled instantly when my ass hit the bench as another flash of torture sliced through my lower body like a Lilliputian spear. I stood up gingerly and pulled down my pants, twisting my neck to try and see my own ass, which isn't easy, let me tell you, and there it was, the parting gift of the asylum. 1 last thumbtack sticking out of my left buttock. Change that number to 69. The tacks of Jericho. Stick 'em in, man. Epilogue Part 2. A few days ago, as of this writing, I was sitting at the pool at the hotel where the entire company was staying for WrestleMania 33 when Ambrose approached me and showed me a picture on his phone. Unbeknownst to me, a toy company had just released an Asylum match playset complete with a breakable Mitch the Potted Plant. So despite the fact that critics hated the first Asylum match, I'm sure they'll be happy to know that since there is now a playset of the structure, there will probably be another one. You're welcome.
And that's all we have here. This is the end of part 2. This is Chris Jericho Knows a Four-Letter Word, audiobook part 2. Now, there will be a part 3. It will be the final part. We are, I believe, at chapter 18, I believe. So we're mostly done with this book. We're 2 hours in on this part. And it's been a good, interesting book. Jericho talks about taking breaks in between WWE, being where it's rock band Fozzy, being a host of America's Funniest Home Videos, creative differences, the back and forth he had with Vince and others. But very interesting to see. But I will put out a part 3. Like I said in the beginning, if you want to check out part 1 of this audiobook, the link is in the description. I repeat, the link is in the description. Also, like and subscribe here so you can guys also keep the notification bell on and know when next time I put out part 3 of this audiobook and other audiobooks, and also when I go live talking about regular Raw and SmackDown. But thank you all for coming out. Appreciate it. Appreciate all the support. Now, it will be probably later this week, or it could be early as tomorrow. I'll put out the following part 3 of the audiobook, the final part. Not next week, the latest, but definitely part 3 will be the final part of No is a Four-Letter Word, audiobook of Chris Jericho. So thank you guys once again. Greatly appreciate it. Check out other audiobooks out as well. Great shit. Soon, 2 videos will pop up. One will be Why Would This Be Feud of the Year? Next will be Backlash 2024 review and graded analysis. Until then, it is OUT.